Good afternoon and welcome to True Crime Mysteries. If you're new to the channel, hello and welcome, and if you're returning, welcome back. Today we're discussing 3 more solved cold cases. Let's get into it. Number 1. Lori Houts. On September 5th, 1992 in Mountain View, California, a person jogging noticed something odd. It was evening and the surrounding buildings were mostly owned by tech giants. The parking lot in the 1300 block of Crittendale Lane, which is now owned by Google, was mostly empty. Though it wasn't unusual to see cars still parked in the lot this late, someone appeared to be sleeping in one of them. The jogger approached and made the shocking realization that the person wasn't sleeping. Law enforcement arrived on the scene and quickly identified the person in the car as 25-year-old Lori Houts, and they quickly deemed her death as a homicide as she still had a nylon rope around her neck. Detectives determined that she had died in the car as there were signs of a struggle. Her purse was recovered nearby, thrown over a fence near the crime scene. What stood out to detectives was that it appeared that the killer had been in the passenger seat, where they might have expected the killer to have been in the back seat. This led to detectives to believe that whoever killed Lori had been someone she knew or was comfortable letting into her car. Numerous fingerprints were recovered from in and around the vehicle. Lori worked nearby and had been expected to attend a wedding later that evening. With the help of her boyfriend, they'd been able to piece together her day. Lori worked for Adobe and worked less than 2 miles from where she was found. She planned to pop into the office. It had been a Saturday, and she hadn't planned on staying long after going home, getting dressed up, and meeting her boyfriend Brent at the wedding. Lori was a computer engineer, and she had landed the job at Adobe and was one of the few women working at the tech giant. She had been known to be an extremely hard worker, often going to work on the weekend and working late. She was incredibly talented and was a rising star in her field. This was right before the tech boom in Silicon Valley. Because she and her boyfriend were going to meet at the wedding, her absence wasn't initially a cause for concern. At first, he had just assumed that she had gotten wrapped up with something at work, and Brent hoped she would turn up later, but she never did. Detectives were able to rule Brent out as a suspect, as he'd been miles away at the wedding where many people witnessed him. During his interview, he did allude to someone who may have been angry enough with Lori to kill her. He alleged that his roommate John Woodward had been increasingly aggressive towards Lori. They'd been dating for 5 weeks, and when he told his roommate that he had a serious girlfriend, he said that John started acting jealous. Brent was set up with a recording device and was asked by law enforcement to call John and get him to confess to murdering Lori. During that conversation, John didn't act surprised he was being investigated. There hadn't been a moment where he questioned why cops were looking at him. John didn't explicitly say that he killed Lori, but he did ask Brent what and how much evidence did the police have against him. Not exactly something an innocent person would say, but it wasn't enough. John was picked up for an interview and his prints were taken. He didn't have an alibi for that day. He claimed he was home alone and no one was able to corroborate that. While investigating Lori's car, they found over 80 fingerprints. Prints were found on the roof of the passenger side of the vehicle as well as the handle and the inside of the door. The prints were a match for John Woodward. He was first arrested later that year and was charged with Lori's murder. His trial was in 1995, which resulted in a hung jury. There wasn't enough evidence. In the second trial in 1996, the judge didn't allow the prosecution to bring forward the prints found inside the vehicle or any discussions that John had killed Lori out of jealousy, as there wasn't solid enough evidence to prove that. The second jury also came back with a hung verdict, and the case was ultimately dismissed. After that, Woodward moved to the Netherlands, where he was the CEO of ReadyTech. Though the company remained based in California, its CEO headed their Amsterdam offices. After the second trial, the case ultimately went cold. No other suspects were discovered. There hadn't been any other evidence found that pointed to anyone else being in that vehicle. In 2020, the case was reopened with several pieces of evidence sent out for further examination. This time, they were looking for DNA. In 2021, they had the results that tied John Woodward directly to Lori's murder. DNA matching Woodward's was found on the rope that had strangled her. Woodward was still living in Amsterdam, and the U.S. Department of Justice worked collaboratively with the Dutch government. Dutch authorities arrested Woodward and executed a search warrant for his home and office. On July 9, 2022, John Woodward was extradited back to the U.S., where he was arrested at the airport in New York. Woodward, now 58, is being held without bail while he waits extradition back to California, where his trial will be held. Lori's sister, in a brief statement to the media, extended her thanks to law enforcement for continuing to pursue her sister's murder and for ensuring there was justice. She said of her sister, "Lori was someone we all aspired our daughters to be like, kind, loyal, and fun. The way Lori lived and treated people was a stunning example of what was right in the world. She was a gem to many, but her bright life was taken from us at the age of 25. This case is the culmination of incredible determination by our detectives over the decades and with phenomenal teamwork with our agency partners here in Santa Clara County and in New York," said Mountain View Police Chief in a press release issued by the department.
John Woodward was arrested back in 1992 and tried twice for the murder of Lori Houts. Now police say they believe they have evidence to put him behind bars.
She didn't get to meet my kids. I probably would have nieces and nephews now from her.
Lori Houts was 25 years old when she was strangled to death after leaving work on September 5, 1992. Mountain View police say 58-year-old John Woodward was arrested Saturday at New York's JFK airport for Houts' murder.
You know, it doesn't really matter what happens because Lori is not coming back. We don't get to win and get our sister back. We get to win and maybe get some justice or some closure.
Family and friends gathered Monday after hearing of the arrest. Houts' best friend Marilyn, who met Lori in junior high school and went to college with her, has maintained a close relationship with her family.
I was very proud of her, and she stood her own, whether it was in the classroom or us playing co-ed softball, co-ed basketball in college. We miss that.
Woodward was last tried for Houts' murder in the mid-90s, and for the second time, he was not convicted. Police believe he killed her because of jealousy.
The motive, as much as we understand, is a love triangle, essentially, of the suspect lived with a male roommate, we believe was romantically interested in the male roommate, and he was dating the victim at the time.
Number 2, Lucia Jackson.
Lake Wildwood is a place far from town. Quiet. Peaceful. Eerie, almost, when the mist settles on the water. It's the last place Lisa Jackson was seen splashing around with her 2 older brothers on September 7th, 1979. They walked home. Lisa said she'd follow. She never did.
As a parent, you know, your child is missing. You can't find her. You have no idea where she's at or what's happened to her, what's going on with her. It makes you want to try to solve this at whatever expense.
6 days later, Lisa's naked body was found in the woods a half-mile from the lake near an oil field.
She was found by a worker who actually went out to check one of the lines.
The 12-year-old had been raped and strangled. These are never-before-seen photos. Tire tracks from the suspect's car. Her little shirt in tatters.
This is the shirt that Lisa had on.
Lisa's blue bikini found next to her. Her glasses spotted by Lisa's brother in the middle of a nearby intersection, bent and cracked. We won't show you the other pictures investigators took that day.
The photos are very gruesome.
Detectives chased hundreds of leads. Weeks turned into months, months turned into years. Time is running out.
You got to understand this is one of our oldest cases. People are starting to get very old, so if you have we're talking witnesses even or family in their 70s. So, you know, you only have so much time before everyone is deceased.
It was on September 7th, 1979 in Conroe, Texas, when 12-year-old Lucia Jackson was swimming at a lake with her 2 older brothers. The kids had walked to Lake Wildwood and lived nearby. Eventually, Lucia's brothers were ready to go home, but she wanted to stay longer. Her brothers started walking home, and they eventually saw her trailing behind and didn't think much of it. When the boys got home, they expected Lucia to walk through the front door shortly after they did. She hadn't been that far behind them when they last saw her, but she never did. They went back outside and didn't see her. They walked the route back and couldn't find any sign of their sister. Law enforcement was contacted shortly after and conducted a thorough investigation of the area, but again, nothing was found. The following day, the boys went back out to look for their sister. They felt responsible for her disappearance. What had been a silly argument between siblings had turned into something awful. That was when Lucia's tortoiseshell glasses were found in an intersection between the lake and their house, and they knew for certain that something bad had happened. Her parents filed an official missing persons report after the glasses were found, and the investigation focused on the belief that Lucia had been abducted. 6 days later, oil field workers discovered a body in a heavily wooded area. They had gone in to check on a pipeline that cuts through Conroe. The body was confirmed to be that of Lucia Jackson. Her murder was ruled a homicide, with her cause of death being strangulation. She had been sexually assaulted, with her clothing recovered in the area. Tire tread marks were also preserved as evidence, but there was little other evidence for investigators to go on. It was noted that the day that she disappeared, Lucia had been wearing a gold butterfly necklace with a matching gold butterfly ring. The ring was never recovered, and detectives had hoped it had been taken by the killer and one day could be used as evidence. But that never panned out, and the ring remained lost. For 4 decades, the case sat cold. Hundreds of leads came in over the years, and each one was investigated but never led to any advances in the case. As the years went on, so did the hopes of ever solving the case. In 2021, the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Homicide Unit decided to reinvestigate Lucia Jackson's case. They sent off several items of evidence for advanced DNA testing. After 40 years, they had new DNA evidence. July 2022, the DNA matched with someone within CODIS, the National FBI database. Gerald Dwight Casey. Records show that Casey lived in Conroe at the time of Lucia's murder. It is unclear if there were additional victims connected to Casey. Casey had an extensive criminal history which included violent robberies, assault, and drug-related offenses. He had been in and out of prison frequently between 1976 and 1989. He was arrested in 1989 for robbery and murder. In 1991, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. Casey's sentence was carried out in 2002. Lucia's cold case has now been closed, making it the MCSO's oldest cold case to be solved. In a statement to the media, they said, "The tenacity and diligence in solving this case by a dedicated team is a reminder to our public and to those who commit crimes in our communities that we will never cease our efforts to solve the hardest of cases and bring closure to traumatized families." Number 3, William Hamilton. This next, now solved cold case highlights how instrumental it is to keep these cold cases in the media. You truly never know who will see the coverage that may be instrumental in providing a piece of key information that will solve a case. On February 26, 1999, in a wooded area behind an old church cemetery in DeKalb County, Georgia, the body of a small child was discovered. The body had badly decomposed over the winter and was estimated to have been there for 3 to 4 months. The child was a boy, African American, around 4 feet tall, with a small frame, and his age was estimated between 5 and 7. He had been wearing a plaid and navy blue hoodie, red denim jeans, and Timberland boots. Law enforcement in the area worked hard to try and identify the child, but no one came forward. There also weren't any missing persons reports matching his description. An autopsy was done which showed he had high levels of diphenhydramine and acetaminophen from over-the-counter pain relievers and Benadryl in his system. Additionally, he had a significant head wound on his skull. Either the drug overdose or the injury could have been the cause of his death. When they couldn't identify him locally, they opted to do advanced testing on his teeth to see if there were any markers that would indicate he had been born and raised somewhere else. That examination came back to determine he was likely from the southeastern U.S., either Georgia or the Florida area. Medical examiners on his case started to call him Dennis to give the little boy something to be called other than the Clifton John Doe. It had been a case that spoke to many, with media across the U.S. featuring his case. Without identification, the case eventually went cold, but detectives were determined to find who this boy was and what happened to him. Several different reconstructions were done over the years, from a model figure to several reconstruction images. Annually, they would hold memorial events to keep his story in the media. It was one of these events in May 2020 that caught the eye of one woman. The woman had been looking for answers regarding a little boy she used to babysit who had disappeared decades earlier. 7-year-old William Deshaun Hamilton. She called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's tip line with a possible identification for the unidentified child. This tip was the first major lead in the case in over 20 years. An investigation began to find William Hamilton, who had lived in Charlotte, North Carolina in the late 90s. They traced his school records there, and when they investigated further, they learned that William's mother had abruptly pulled him out of the school year in December '98 and told people she was moving to Atlanta. It was only months after that when the body of the little boy was discovered. There were no records of William Hamilton after he was pulled from school. No medical records, school registrations, activity on a social insurance number. He simply vanished. This led investigators to believe that Ava had been correct in her identification. The next step was to locate his mother, Teresa Ann Bailey Black, who had been the last person to have been with William, but tracking her down hadn't been easy. She had left Atlanta in late '98 and returned back to Charlotte, Georgia. It was then that William's absence was noticed, especially to Ava. Teresa gave conflicting accounts to anyone who asked about where William was, and she eventually left Georgia, disappearing for nearly a decade. She resurfaced in Alaska in 2010, then moved to Phoenix, Arizona, which was where she was located by law enforcement. She was arrested in June 2022 and required to submit DNA to compare to the remains of the little boy, and after 23 years, they could finally officially identify Little John Doe as William Hamilton. Teresa Bailey Black, now 45 years old, was arrested and will be extradited back to Georgia, where she will be charged with 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of child cruelty, aggravated assault, and concealment of death. So far, it has not been released if she has cooperated with law enforcement or has provided details of what happened to William in '98. It has been reported that Bailey Black is not in good health. Her booking photos show she has a medical tube in. She also arrived in court in a wheelchair. She had also previously served prison in '94 for manslaughter and had a criminal history with several other nonviolent offenses.
For Ava, her long search for William is finally over.
This was God's plan, maybe give him a love and attention that he needed, and to be the one to pick up these pieces for him after she scattered them and thought they couldn't be put together. Maybe that was my purpose of coming into his life, to make sure that once his life was taken, that I would get him justice, and I have.
Well, that is it for this video. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you like this content and what I do over here, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss my next upload. If you give this video a like if you enjoyed the content, that would be much appreciated, as it is the easiest way to help the channel grow. We also have channel membership as well as Patreon for anyone interested if you'd like to get more behind the scenes or exclusive content, or just to support the channel. In the description box of this video, you will also find links to all my socials to connect with me, as well as other goodies. But that is it for me. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you on the next one. Bye for now.